Chapter 1. All over again. The war on supernatural creatures in Beacon Hills had died down a few, since the two-faced shapeshifter called the Anuk-ite was its major kickstarter. It fed off of people's fears, brought out their worst nightmares, drove them to panic, insanity, and despair, ending their own lives eventually. It was supposed to ride with the hunt forever. These were the words of Halloween, the hellhound who helped build Icon House and froze himself for 100 years, waiting for a miserable day the ancestral creature managed by some means to escape. Looking for its two faces, the Anuk-ite made the decision to conquer shapeshifters' body, believing their strength would also make it even more powerful once the two parts merged, powerful enough to never be trapped again. And it worked. It went on its merry way, petrifying everyone and anyone who dared crossing its gaze. Gerrard, the patriarch of the Argent family, wasted no time and seized the golden opportunity in order to further push his ultimate agenda, the annihilation of supernatural creatures from the surface of the planet. He hoped to expand and reach more people around the globe and gather more supporters to his cause. So in the effort to defeat his sworn enemy, Scott McCall, he teamed up with none other than the Anuk-ite, who also seemed to have a particular interest in the true Alpha. Only, caught in the hype of winning a few battles, the new allies omitted a crucial detail, more so a flaw. You can't have the power of a shapeshifter without equally having its weaknesses, and so was the downfall of that plan, and their end was on the hands of Scott and his back, who swore to honor the code of their late friend Allison, to protect those who cannot protect themselves. All of these events were vivid memories carved onto a lot of people's minds. That was certainly the case for Deputy Parrish. From time to time, images would flash before his eyes, stuck revisiting all that happened during the past 5 years. Starting from the day he first walked into Beacon Hills, he was hit with the inexplicable feeling of being drawn to that place. To the day he realized he was no longer a mere human like he used to be. The realization of what he was and what his role consisted of, his bloody and ferocious battles against the beast, the strong bond that tied him to banshees and ghost riders. All of it played back in his head so realistically that he would lose all sense of awareness and reality, hearing only the echoes of sounds and conversation he once had or heard. Sometimes he'd sink so deep into his contemplations that he'd forget where he was or what he was doing. For instance, he didn't realize that his car had stopped until his colleague, Deputy Fisher, brought him out of his train of thought, back to reality. When she opened the door and slid inside, neither her chestnut hair nor the brown of her eyes were properly distinguishable under the gas station lights. She was a 5'5", athletically built, beautiful young woman in her 20s. He flinched and looked in her direction, eyes wide open. She seemed to notice his surprise because once she was comfortable in the passenger seat, she quickly asked, "Is everything all right?" Concern was showing on her face. "Yes, everything is fine," he replied nervously before shifting his eyes towards the windshield. Confused expression appearing on his face. He looked through the car windows, almost like he was wondering how he'd gotten there. "We're at the gas station," Fisher said. She did catch his attention, but when he still didn't say anything, she added, "You asked me to fill the tank." A mix of comprehension and frustration in his eyes confirmed Fisher's suspicion. She knew that look very well, regardless of the fact that she'd only been his partner for a month. "Still happening?" she asked. Parrish took a deep breath and gripped the steering wheel tightly with both hands. After staying that way for a few seconds, he finally relaxed, his expression softening. "It's like I was there again," he finally admitted. She discerned defeat and distress in his eyes. Even though she was the type of person to know exactly what to say to a human being in these situations, she also knew that Parrish wasn't a regular human being. Perhaps his increasingly frequent moments of absence meant something other than what she was used to with regular people. "You said that you got help from someone to figure out what supernatural creature you were." and that they helped you evolve and embrace your power. Maybe they can help you with this too, she asked. Parrish understood that she was talking about Chris Argent, and he didn't take long to think about her question. Yeah, but this time it's different. This time, I think everyone is dealing with what I have. Some may even have it worse than me. She stared down for an instant, debating whether she should voice her ideas or not, and her demeanor shifted from compassion to determination as she focused back on him. Maybe it's more of a reason to talk to him about it, so that you can help each other. She marked a brief pause when he started the car and drove back on the road. And once the vehicle was rolling in a straight line, she continued. After I tragically lost my mother, the only thing that really helped me was talking about it with other people that were going through the same trauma. She kept talking, but no matter how hard Parrish tried to concentrate on her words, her voice became increasingly echoey and far away sounding, giving the impression that she was talking from the depth of a well. He became aware of a low, fuzzy sound, static emanating from the car radio. The longer it went, the louder it got, until suddenly a voice came through, someone breathing heavily. It was a woman's voice, and it felt like she was struggling to talk. After a few attempts, she finally managed to spit out something cohesive. It came out in a whisper, almost like she was on the verge of death. "Hellhound," she gasped, and resumed panting. "What was that?" Parrish questioned, looking away from the road to the radio. "What was what?" Fisher stopped speaking and seemed puzzled as to what he was talking about. But before she could add anything, she lifted her gaze towards the road for a split second. "Watch out!" she screamed, putting her arms forward, resting her hands on the dashboard in an attempt to prepare for a brusque halt. Parrish was so absorbed by the sound coming from the radio that he had forgotten the car was still rolling. Startled by Fisher's scream, he jumped straight back into his seat facing the roadway to see that he was about to drive right into someone standing in the middle of the otherwise empty road. He abruptly swerved to the side, luckily managing to stop the car after swerving only once. They immediately jumped out to make sure the individual was all right, but also to ask them what they were doing out there in the middle of the night. By the time their feet hit the pavement, the person had already disappeared. The two deputies looked at each other, shocked and bewildered by what had just occurred. "You saw that too, right? I wasn't hallucinating?" Fisher asked in a panicked voice. "Only if we had the same hallucination," replied Parrish, while turning his flashlight on. They both circled around the car in opposite directions, drawing their weapons alongside their flashlights. They figured whoever it was, if it was fast enough to disappear in that time span, then it had to be a supernatural, and they didn't want to take any chances. They scrutinized the area for over 5 minutes, and finally concluded that the person or creature had to have been long gone. Fisher was already heading back towards the car, shaking her head, wondering internally what it could have been, when Parrish was having a similar silent dialogue with himself. Couldn't have been a coincidence, he thought. And for a good reason. 2 mystifying events on the same night, moreover the same minute. Definitely couldn't have been a coincidence, though he was quickly snapped out of his reverie by his partner, once again. Chapter 2. Plan A. "Where is she?" said a rather tense, deep, and gravelly masculine voice. Not longer than 5 seconds later, another one replied, this one much softer and feminine sounding. "On her way there. She will reach out when she can." Although gentle and definitely on the quieter side, there was no doubt she was filled with confidence nonetheless. The young man took a deep breath, clutched his machine gun tighter between his hands, hugging it closer to his chest. His patience was reaching its limits. Beads of sweat began to form at the top of his forehead, only to drip down along his face. "This is taking too long," he spoke again, unable to hide the panic overpowering his anger. "It's not particularly taking any longer than usual," replied his partner, while comfortably sitting on a trunk box, undoubtedly containing more weaponry. Both her absence of agitation and lack of excessive sweating were a perfect indicator of her large experience in the matter, though her steady and emotionless tone didn't contribute in helping calm him. On the contrary, he grew more nervous and fidgety. How could she be so calm, so indifferent to what we're doing? She didn't even look at me when she spoke. How many times did she do this? How many of them did she kill? The more questions he asked himself, the closer he was coming to the realization that after that day, there was no going back. He will be a totally different person, new man. Neither he liked it or not, he still wasn't entirely sure. That thought alone sent a chill down his spine. He couldn't see what she was doing from where he was standing, but he stuck to the impression that she was cleaning her already immaculate hunting knife's blade. No surprise there. She had always been obsessed with it, as far back as he could remember. And he wasn't wrong. She could clearly see her reflection in that large, deadly blade, yet she kept going at it with a similarly clean claw. She only stopped from time to time to admire the shine of what she deemed a treasure. The idea that he couldn't take any of it back was closing in on him. He was losing control over his emotions, out of patience to give. His breath accelerated, quickly followed by his legs. He moved a few feet forward, determined to get it done, to prove to himself that he could do it. Now, to prove to himself that it was the right thing to do, he came to a sudden halt, aimed his gun down, ready to pull the trigger, eyes transfixed on someone lying silently on their left side. The boy looked like he couldn't be a day over 16 years old. His black frizzy hair covered in dust just as much as his clothes. His hands tied behind his back. The dry blood on his forehead was already darkening. Perfectly still, the only part of his body moving was his chest as a result of inhaling and exhaling. "Daniel, control yourself." Her cold and monotone voice broke the unbearable silence, startling Daniel. When he turned his attention back to his target, however, his eyes locked with those of the boy. A sense of dread overtook him, all his doubts becoming more vocal. Was it really the right thing to do? He tried with all his might to suppress any other emotion other than hate, disgust, and repulsion, but to no avail. His eyes slightly softened, getting shinier, filling with tears, and thus betraying him. "It's now or never," he practically shouted, shaking with rage, but also hesitation. "I have to do it. I need to do it," he continued. All the while the boy didn't move an inch. "Then do it," the woman exclaimed, finally stopping her activity and raising an eyebrow. Turned out she could make other facial expressions other than the indifference she was showing. She ran out of patience herself. Had enough babysitting the new guy on the job. Daniel wrapped his finger further around the trigger as if he was ready to get it over with. For a split second he glanced around the room. On the floor were 9 other people lying down, tied up. Some looked back at him with anger and hate, others with fear and tears. "What are you waiting for?" she firmly added, gazing at the wall in front of her. He kept looking back and forth between the hostages. "Why are you looking at me like that?" he spat at the boy. "Alice?" Daniel pleaded with his partner as he felt his confidence fading. The so-called Alice slowly put her knife down beside her, shot up, then started walking towards Daniel. Unbeknownst to her, she was being watched from the moment she walked in that abandoned building. Or more correctly, since they all walked in. A pair of yellow glowing eyes started reflecting on her shiny blade from above. Whosever eyes those belonged to, and proceeded to discreetly follow her. She stopped beside Daniel, eyed him with a look of disappointment as he was gradually lowering his weapon, face red like a tomato, his veins falling short of popping under his skin. Alice turned her attention to the boy, and with a malicious and condescending smile, she said, "Alec, Isn't that right? She marked a pause as she pulled her gun and pointed it down at his head. Then she added, "Any last words?" Alex smiled back and calmly retorted with nothing more than one word. "Coyote." Everything after that happened in less time necessary for anything to be comprehended. First, there was guttural sound which turned out to be growling. Then Alice was thrown to the ground and disarmed after a male humanoid figure with yellow glowing eyes and dirty blonde hair jumped on her. Daniel took a hit straight to the back of his head. He fell forward, revealing a fit young woman standing behind him. She had short brown hair, unnaturally glowy blue eyes, a pair of fangs, and a set of claws instead of fingernails. "Why so long?" The blond young man chose that moment to reprimand Alec for taking so long to give the signal. "Can you cut me loose first, at least?" replied Alec, a bit offended. "He's right, Liam. Now is not the time," interjected the woman as she was rapidly untying everyone else. "Where are the others?" asked Alec, while relying on Liam to stand and run. The woman, whose name was Malia, was supporting a girl that seemed completely out of it, her long hair dangling in front of her face. All of them were now speeding along a hallway towards the exit of the building. "Well, Stiles is driving. Lydia is standing guard outside, just in case. And Derek is..." Liam didn't get time to finish when a body shot out of a door right ahead of them, stopping them dead in their tracks. The figure crashed on the wall across. They all simultaneously looked at said door, and there he stood, Derek Hale. Eyes still glowing blue, fangs, claws, the whole 9 yards. "Derek is right here," he said, smiling at them. They made it out of that place. Everyone who was held captive immediately squinted their eyes. The sun was still up and shining. A 5'3" strawberry blonde woman ran in their direction. "Oh great, you guys are here," she declared, out of breath, but clearly happy nonetheless. "Lydia? Where is the ride?" asked the confused Liam. "Oh, somewhere," she replied, slowly nodding and tightening her lips, not having an answer to that question. Malia, Liam, and Derek all frowned and turned to the same direction, followed by Lydia and the others. Not long after, a bus emerged from around the corner of what appeared to be another abandoned building, approaching the group at high speed. "Never mind," muttered Derek. Its doors opened a few seconds before the vehicle briskly came to a halt, and they could finally see the driver. A white young man, brown hair, brown eyes, and a ridiculous smile. Obviously proud of the entrance he just made. Well, it was obvious because as soon as they reached him, he asked, "How was my entrance? Epic, huh?" His facial expression switched to disappointment before he got any response. "Alec, buddy, you look awful," he added, slowly shaking his head. "Oh, thanks, Stiles. I hadn't really noticed," replied Alex sarcastically as he took the seat behind him. The group helped the others settle and came back to the front of the bus. They still weren't ready to leave yet. They were still missing a friend, a member of their group, their pack. A pack indeed. By then, it was completely unnecessary to state that they were not ordinary people. Derek, Liam, and Alec were werewolves. Malia was a were-coyote, Lydia a banshee, and Stiles... Well, Stiles was possessed by a very evil spirit for a while. Now he is better. He was one of the very few humans in the pack. Right then, that pack was missing its alpha. "Where is Scott?" questioned Malia. "You should have been out by now," said Lydia, just as worrisome as her friend. A ground-shaking growl erupted from the building, followed by a goosebump-inducing howl. And there he was, the true alpha, standing tall on the edges of the 3rd floor, his eyes shining a blinding red. He jumped only to land effortlessly 3 stories below, near the entrance. He held all of their attention as He got on the bus with a heartwarming smile. "I told you it would work," he said with a radiant smile. They all chuckled at his comment. Malia sighed in relief, and they proceeded to get settled on a seat before the bus started moving. Their rescue plan sailed smoothly this time, but it wasn't always cupcakes. They had to retreat and swallow a lot of losses in the past 3 years since the defeat of the Anuk-ite. The pack fought a lot of enemies before. Only then they had to stand against large groups of the dominant intelligent species, where their strength wasn't only in their weapons but in their numbers as well. Humans were known to wage long-lasting wars against who and whatever they feared or hated, and supernatural creatures simply weren't an exception to that rule. Chapter 3. A hasty pair of feet walked through the hallways of Beacon Hills Memorial Hospital, only decelerating around corners to avoid any collision with staff or worse, patients. A nurse was rushing to greet an incoming patient. She charged towards a gurney carrying a woman who, at first glance, seemed in her 30s. "Chris?" Melissa called out to the man that brought the victim in. Then, as she started running along with the stretcher, she added, "Why the front doors?" "She's human," he replied. "What happened?" Melissa questioned again. "Gunshots. Hunters," he answered. Melissa's facial expressions twisted in a way that perfectly translated her utter shock and confusion. Her reaction was justified. Ever since the big clash between humans and supernaturals back in 2013, a precise number of nurses and doctors took the task to care for supernaturals when they were brought in. They were usually admitted through the back doors and kept separate from other patients to avoid any unwanted situations. Chris simply shook his head and implied that he would explain everything later on. The woman was crying and pleading to whoever would listen. "Where is he? Where is my son?" she implored, but nobody answered. Another nurse held her hand and was too busy repeating, "It's going to be okay. You're going to be fine. Please calm down." She was taken into the OR in order to undergo surgery. The doors closed, leaving Chris behind standing alone, arms hanging down on both sides of his body. He was dressed in an all-black uniform. A leaf fell out of his vest pocket when he pulled his phone out, suggesting that he'd spent some time in the Beacon Hills Preserve, scouting for potential endangered supernaturals or humans. How ironic, he thought to himself. Just a few years back, his priority was to protect humans from the dangers of the supernatural world. How the tables had turned. His screen lit up. He sat down in anticipation for news of any kind when he saw that he'd received a message from Scott. It read, "Monroe is on her way to you. She left Los Angeles not long ago." Alec had communicated to the rest of the pack everything he heard during his time being captured by the hunters. Since he was the last member of the pack to stay unidentified, it was mostly his role to infiltrate and collect information. Chris Argent sunk in the waiting room chair, recollecting his memories of the past 6 hours in the forest, replaying the events for no other reason than finding out if there was any way he could have changed the outcome. He jolted out of his thoughts when Melissa called for him to follow her. Hours had passed since the patient he brought went to surgery. She ushered him into a room where the woman was lying peacefully asleep on a bed. It appeared she was out of the danger zone. She closed the door behind her, then turned to face Chris, both hands on her hips. "What's the story?" she asked, peering at the woman for a second before looking back at him. "We were doing our round in the forest as usual. We heard gunshots, screams, both human and inhumane. Took us about 10 minutes to reach the source. There were 5 bodies, mutilated beyond recognition. At best, I can confirm there were hunters. She was the only one with gunshot wounds," finished Chris by pointing out the woman on the bed. "What about the boys? Where are they?" she continued. Nolan stayed put with Stilinski at the scene. Corey and Mason took some pictures for Deaton. Maybe he could enlighten us about the kind of creature that would be capable of this. It wasn't a werewolf? The more information she received, the more confused, scared, and concerned she grew. Even from the distance we stood at, it sounded nothing like a werewolf's growl. As for the injuries, we couldn't even tell which were bite marks and which were claw marks. As he was speaking, Chris slowly came to realize that he was, yet again, hands deep into something stranger and far more dangerous than what he was comfortable with. There were more than one? No way to tell, he answered. They marked a pause in which they both silently contemplated the idea that one creature could take 5 hunters armed to the teeth on its own. Then, almost as if someone had slapped Melissa across the face, she jumped. What about her son? She kept asking about him when she came in. There was nobody else there. Not alive, at least. She was the only survivor. This only raised more flags in their minds. Crazy hunters were one thing, but a new supernatural threat? Humans were already on high alert. For 3 years, everyone seemed to be walking on eggshells, and then this. Whatever happened, however, they were forced to wait for the woman to wake up. At the same time, miles away from the hospital... Crap, muttered Sheriff Stilinski under his breath, looking down upon a number of disfigured bodies, while his team was scanning the area and collecting evidence. He took a deep breath and exhaled before gesturing to Nolan to come near. A young man dressed similarly to Argent obliged. Walk me through it again, son, said Stilinski. Yes, we heard a scream and a very unusual growl. I don't know what it really was because I've never heard anything like it before. Then immediately after that, a gunshot rain, answered Nolan. Anything else? Yes, when we got close to the scene, they all ceased fire at the same time. Kinda like it was synchronized, the young man added. Or it took one blow to take all of them down at once. Stilinski frowned at that thought. Just like Argent, the fear of a new all-out war froze him for a moment. But Nolan's voice brought him out of his trance. We didn't really take the time to look for more. The woman we found was critically injured. He stopped before quickly adding, gunshot wounds, nothing supernatural. He perceived the apprehension in the sheriff's face. At least they could choke the hunter's fate to self-defense, but that woman seemed to have nothing to do with them. The victims were drenched in blood, big gashes open all over their bodies, wounds so profound that the bones could be seen in some places. The rest was covered in smaller scale slashes, and after closer examination, there seemed to be no bite marks. Chapter 4. Black Blood. The vet was seemingly hunched over, both hands gripping the table's edge to support his upper body, as his gaze was deep into a set of 6 photos aligned in front of him. Mason, you said that the gunshots all ceased at once? He asked one of the 2 young men that were standing with him in the animal clinic. Yes, it was like they were silenced at the same time, replied Mason, still perplexed by what just came out of his own mouth. Without taking his eyes off of the picture, the vet continued. Whatever it was, it must have been fast and cut deep. It? So you're sure it was a single creature that did that? Intervened the second young man, as baffled and confused as his partner. Take a closer look at the slash. He pointed to one of the pictures as he slightly budged to leave enough space in front of him. He resumed talking once the boys moved closer to him. If you align the pictures this way, what can you notice? He proceeded to put the photos in set order. On 5 of the images, a different body was displayed. They all had multiple wounds scattered randomly on the corpses. However, one fairly big gash on their chest seemed to be common for everyone. From the depth of the injury and the trajectory, it was logical to deduce that it was inflicted to all victims at the same time. But who? What? Blabbered the boy, even more surprised than before. Yes, Corey, it's exactly what you are thinking. This wound was inflicted by one strike only. can say for sure that this is the cause of death," retorted Dr. Deaton in his usual calm tone. "I should be able to tell more if I examine the bodies up close." "But these don't look like normal werewolf claw marks," quizzed Mason. "Nor talons, for that matter," added Corey. "No, indeed. This slash appears to be too big, too wide for a werewolf to make," finished the doctor. An instant of silence passed when they just stood completely quiet, trying to absorb the information they just received before they heard the doors to the clinic fly open. The sound of a bell ringing and frantic breathing. "Doc, we need help," a man's voice yelled behind the wall. They ran to find out who it was and how they could help him. 2 men were standing at the entrance. The one that yelled for help seemed to be in his early 40s, soaked in his own sweat and eyes wide open. He was holding the other young man's arm around his neck to support him and keep him from falling. "Peter?" asked Mason. "What's wrong with Theo?" bumped in Corey before Peter could say anything. Theo was barely conscious. The doctor moved forward and grabbed his other arm to put it around his own neck. Then, both Peter and Deaton dragged Theo to the table in order to be examined. "What the hell happened?" Mason freaked out. "Give me 5 minutes to breathe. Please. I just ran a mile with this dipstick on my back," begged Peter while trying to catch his breath. "You should be healing by now." "This doesn't make any sense," said the confused Deaton. "Well, don't expect me to make any sense of it. I mean, we didn't even see the thing. It was so fast, even with werewolf eyes, I couldn't see it coming. The darkness didn't help either," spat Peter without taking a breath, angry at the situation he was put in. Theo remained senseless on the table, lying on his back, eyes closed. His heart rate wasn't slowing. He was struggling to respire. His shirt was torn. His shirt was torn off, allowing his bare skin to be visible. A large wound stretched from left to right across his chest. Mason abandoned his shocked face, squinted his eyes, and opened his mouth ready to speak. But nothing came out. Corey noticed his expression and immediately asked, "What are you thinking about?" That directed Peter's and Deaton's attention on Mason, who kept eyeing Theo's chest. "Mason, what do you have in mind?" quizzed the vet. The wound, it looks like one we already saw tonight," he said as he picked one of the pictures up. The 3 men approached him to see for themselves what he was talking about. The gash was extremely similar to the hunter's laceration, the one that caused their death. "I guess we were the luckier ones tonight," joked Peter. A scream of pain and agony filled the room. They all turned to find its source. They were petrified by the horrifying show taking place before their eyes. The flesh around Theo's wound was gradually changing to a greenish color, quickly replaced by a darker purple, all the while he didn't stop screaming and gasping for air. It was like a sped-up decomposing process, followed soon after by some sort of black blood leaking from his eyes, nose, ears, and mouth. They had to lay him on his side so that he didn't choke on that substance. "Never mind. There are few key differences between the attacks, after all," said Mason, always in a state of stupor. "Peter, I think you are going to have to tell us everything that happened down to the tiniest detail. I do hope his recovery doesn't rely on that, because I saw almost absolutely nothing and there isn't much to tell," replied Peter as they were all trying to hold Theo down on the table. Chapter 5. In the Dark. What happened? That was such a simple-sounding question, yet Peter couldn't find enough words to construct and fill a cohesive sentence. Only a few frames popped clearly back in his mind. The rest of the scene was just a blur. So he started with the first thing he remembered from that night. Earlier that night. "We're taking the east side. They're taking the west side, and we'll meet in the middle. Not that complicated when you think about it," said Peter in a calm but visibly irritated tone. Theo stood in place behind him, put his arms halfway up, and muttered, "Right. Sorry I asked." "Well, Now that we've got the stupid questions out of the way, we can finally be on our way, retorted Peter in the same voice as before. His attitude and choice of words clearly annoyed Theo, who seemed to be acting like it was a casual conversation between them two nonetheless. They walked through the dark forest with a nonchalant air, unbothered by the blackness surrounding them, her glowing eyes being the only flicker to brave the shadows. For how long do you think we'll keep doing this? Theo's voice broke the silence once more. Just keep your head focused on the present, replied Peter, this time definitely more wary than before. Yes, I figured that out on my own, thank you. But you know what I meant. Shh. Peter cut him off and stopped dead in his tracks. Theo followed shortly after, looking down in an attempt to focalize his hearing, but nothing further could be heard. Instead, it was a smell that reached their nostrils. More of a stench. Their facial expressions gradually twisted. They turned to look at each other, but neither one of them had any answers. It smells like, started Peter. Death? Finished Theo. I don't think I have a better word for it, so we'll stick with that. It's coming from this way, said Theo while slowly heading in the direction he had just pointed at. Peter put a hand on Theo's chest as he was about to pass him. Did you hear that? He whispered. It was Theo's turn to perk his ears up. What followed was a few seconds of silence, then, and almost on cue, all hell broke loose. A gut-wrenching mix of a hiss and a growl, relatively distant, but the two men still had to cover their ears. Second came the cascade of gunshot sounds, all of that topped by a woman's high-pitched scream. It made every hair on their bodies stand. They looked at each other again for a split second before Theo launched himself forward, running towards the potential massacre. No, wait! Screamed Peter in an attempt to catch his attention, but to no avail. Oh, hell! He exclaimed before following his companion's track. All he could see was Theo running ahead of him. He froze in place when he heard the sound of leaves violently shaking and branches breaking to his left. A scream of pain erupted just then, and all he had the time to see was his friend falling to his knees and crashing face first onto the ground. Peter ran up and crouched down near him, all the while frantically scanning everything around them in apprehension, hoping that whatever had done that was gone.